everybody, welcome back to Coach Hall Writes. I've seen a lot of questions lately from both teachers and students asking, can I write about, and then it might be personal experience, Disney, religion, politics. So in this video, I'm going to tackle those questions. Before we get started, let's be sure to stay in touch. Please make sure that you subscribe and turn your notifications on. That way you don't miss any upcoming AP Lang content. Also, be sure to check out the description box below for helpful links. In this video, we'll discuss writing about Disney movies, personal experiences, pop culture, religion, politics, and fiction. So you can write about any of these topics, but I'm going to give you some tips on what to consider. That way you can write about them more effectively. Let's start with Disney movies. So one of the reasons why I think teachers might prefer that students don't write about Disney movies is because they're fictional examples, and in some sense, a real world example might be stronger evidence. However, if you are very knowledgeable about a particular movie, then perhaps you could turn it into a compelling piece of evidence. So one thing that I suggest to my students, if they want to write about a Disney movie, or really any movie for that matter, is to concede that it's a fictional example. In my mind, that kind of builds credibility for their argument because they're acknowledging that, yes, this is fictitious. However, there's value to it. I included an example of what this could look like using Moana as the evidence. So this would be one way to concede that while it's a fictitious example, it still exemplifies, in this case, the value of exploring the unknown. If you're referencing a movie, you want to make sure that you provide a brief plot summary. Even if you think most people have seen the movie, you still want to explain the plot in maybe 2 or 3 sentences. That way it clarifies what you're talking about. As you're doing this, consider it an opportunity to incorporate some more advanced grammar. So maybe appositive phrases or dashes or a colon. Because remember, punctuation helps us convey meaning. A couple years ago, I had a student write an essay in which they used Rapunzel from Tangled as evidence. And honestly, the paragraph was quite strong. The student had adequate evidence and strong commentary to support their point. However, as I was reading it, it occurred to me that maybe the student could have written about a real world example or some personal experience instead. So for example, this particular student was talking about how Rapunzel had to go explore the unknown by leaving her tower. And I happened to remember that this student's sibling was going away to college. And it seemed to me like they could use their sibling's story as evidence to prove the same claim. So here's why this matters. You could potentially pair both examples together to prove the same claim and have 2 examples in the one body paragraph. So you could examine the movie example and the personal experience, or you could choose which one you could write about better and have one body paragraph with 1 example. If you feel like writing about a Disney movie would weaken your argument, then ask yourself, can I write about a real world example or personal example instead? Maybe you could think of one that proves the same point that you were trying to prove with the movie, and you could go in that direction. Now, if you decide to write about the movie, make sure you focus on the message or the moral of the movie and be sure to connect it back to the prompt. Don't just assume that the person reading your essay is going to understand why that movie proves your thesis. You have to explain it. So to do this, think about what the producers are trying to convey and what do the viewers learn. The next question is, can I write about personal experience? And I see this question all the time. The answer is yes. In fact, I have a separate video that answers this question in much more detail and gives examples. So I'll be sure to link that in the description box below. There are some prompts that really do lend themselves to students writing about personal experience. And so one follow-up question that students often ask is, if I'm writing about personal experience, can I use first-person pronouns? Well, yes, you can. I know that oftentimes English teachers tell you don't use first person in your writing, and that's true for things like don't say, in this essay I'm going to tell you about, or I think this, or I believe this. Those types of phrases weaken your writing. However, we want to think about personal experience as a rhetorical choice. It's like an anecdote. So you are choosing to write about personal experience because that meaningful experience is going to help you prove your thesis. So if you are, in fact, telling a story about yourself, it's okay to use me, my, I, those first person pronouns. In fact, if it is a real story, don't try to turn that experience into a hypothetical, because in general, hypotheticals weaken your argument. So if it really is the story about you, then go ahead and use those first person pronouns. You can write about a sibling, a parent, a friend. Just be sure that whatever story you're writing about is a meaningful moment, and be sure to provide appropriate context, because we want to make sure that the reader understands not only what was happening, but why it mattered. You also want to consider the placement of your anecdote within your line of reasoning. There is a student sample from the College Board that I love to show my students. It is from the Exploring the Unknown prompt. And in the first paragraph, the intro, the student tells a story about their first time climbing a ropes course. And what I like about this essay is I find that to be a somewhat unique intro. It's using an anecdote to lead into the thesis. And each year that I show my students this essay, several of them then try this technique with their own writing. Now, I'm not saying you have to do this, and I don't think it would fit with every prompt, but for those of you that like creative writing, or maybe you just want a less formulaic essay, you might look into that sample. I'll link it below, and you might try that technique in your next essay. If you do, if you're telling an anecdote in order to convey that personal experience, regardless of where you put it in your essay, make sure that you're using description and detail, so incorporate those adverbs and adjectives to make it more engaging. Now, you don't have to put the anecdote in your intro. In fact, many of my students will use personal experience in their body paragraphs instead. And so when they do this, I encourage them to think about their line of reasoning, because sometimes we get what I've dubbed to be evidence whiplash. And that's when we might go from like a real world example to personal experience with a poor transition, or vice versa. And so sometimes it seems like we're equating two experiences that might not be equal. So for example, if I was writing about exploring the unknown, and I was talking about Amelia Earhart and how she explored the unknown, and then in my next paragraph, I talked about how I tried out for the basketball team, even though I didn't really know how to play basketball, those two experiences might both prove my thesis. But if I'm not careful about my transition, it could feel like we're jumping from one topic to another. And so I would want to perhaps concede that my experience pales in comparison to Amelia Earhart's, but it still reveals that exploring the unknown is valuable. Or I might say that exploring the unknown is not just limited to history or to aviation, it's also pertinent to high school sports as well. Or after talking about Amelia Earhart, I might say, though it's a much smaller or less significant example, my experience with trying out for the basketball team demonstrates that. So you can see how you might use the sentence frames I have on the screen to create that line of reasoning. You can use these sentence frames within a paragraph if you have two examples and you're trying to shift from one to the other, or you could use these as a transition from one body paragraph to the next. If you like these, feel free to take a picture or screenshot of the sentence frames and use them in your own writing. And by the way, if you find it valuable, be sure to hit the thumbs up button, because when you like videos like this, it helps push that content out to other AP Lang teachers and students. So if you're writing about personal experience, make sure that you connect your example to the prompt. Now, you should do this with your evidence in each Q3 essay regardless. However, I have noticed that when students write about personal experience, they tend to assume that the reader understands why what they're talking about matters. And so we want to make sure that we're connecting the dots, because remember, you're trying to convince the reader that does not know you or your story that your experience is meaningful and that the evidence is proving your thesis. Typically with personal experience, we want to focus on the impact of that example or experience. And we also want to focus on personal growth. So to do this with your commentary, you might ask yourself, okay, what would have happened if I didn't have this experience? Or maybe you could ask yourself, what has happened because of this experience, or what will happen because of this experience? Really ask yourself why the story you're telling matters. What does it show your reader about the topic of your essay? Next up is, can I write about pop culture? Now, here's the thing, and this is where I might differ from some other AP Lang teachers, and that's okay. But I want my students to write the most effective paragraph they can, especially in a timed write. And let's be honest, under pressure, sometimes we might forget relevant historical examples, or we might not know a whole lot about current events to write about them well. So while those real world examples might be great, pop culture is also real world evidence. You just kind of know how to write about it well. And if you are very informed about the topic, you can include more details and that will build your credibility. So as with the other topics we've talked about, be sure to provide appropriate context and of course use your grammar in order to convey meaning. You also might want to concede that your example might seem trivial. So for instance, I had a student last year who would write about dance moms in her Q3s quite often. And sometimes she would actually start with a historical example and then shift into dance moms. That's where those sentence frames that I mentioned earlier came in handy because otherwise it's evidence whiplash. But when she would talk about dance moms, she would concede that perhaps it might seem like a trivial example. And that really did help because she acknowledged that it maybe wasn't the most sophisticated example, but it truly did prove her point. And we've already talked about fictitious examples. So in some sense, I would say that because oftentimes pop culture examples are real world examples, they would serve better than a fictitious example. For instance, I would find an example from Dance Moms more convincing than maybe the movie Step Up. Now, as I said that, I realized that a lot of Dance Moms was scripted, but you get the idea. It was presented as if it was reality. So if, for example, you're trying to decide between something real world and a movie or a book, if you could write about the real world example well, that example might serve you better in your essay. Again, I think it all boils down to which example can you write about best under pressure in the allotted time that you have. When thinking about a pop culture example, think about the deeper issue of the example and why it's significant. What does it reveal about society? So let me give you an example of what this could look like. Recently in my AP Lang class, we were talking about some current events and the topic of these NFL jackets came up. If you haven't seen these, you should Google them because Taylor Swift wore one, Simone Biles wore one. But apparently before these mega celebrities started wearing these jackets, some of the other NFL wives were being very critical of this person's style. And so I asked my students, okay, what's the deeper meaning here? So some of my students were talking about how this could be a way to show the value of upcycling or thrifting. Other students saw it as an example of pursuing a passion despite criticism from peers. Both of these are deeper issues related to this topic, so you could take one example and go different directions with it depending on the prompt. Next up is, can I write about politics? So here's the thing, this can be a little dicey because people can be very sensitive about politics, and sometimes when people write about politics, they do so in a very inflammatory way, which is what we want to avoid. As an AP reader, I can tell you that readers evaluate the quality of the argument regardless of whether or not it aligns with their personal worldview. If a reader is worried they cannot be impartial, they will pass the essay on to the table leader. Some of you might be very well versed in politics or very passionate about politics. So if so, make sure you're providing specific facts or observations to support your claims. We don't want to use generalizations. You also want to be mindful of your own potential bias. So earlier in this video, we talked about conceding. There's ways to use phrasing to kind of soften what you're about to say. So for instance, you could say something like, for the sake of argument, let's assume that. Or you could offer a concession and refutation. We also want to avoid hasty generalizations or reductive commentary. These kinds of things happen all over social media, but we don't want to include them in your AP Lang essay. So again, remember, we want to have specific evidence and we want to make sure that what we're saying is something that we can prove. We need facts, not opinion. I have similar advice for those who ask, can I write about religion? So first of all, religious texts of any kind are valid evidence as long as students make sure that evidence clearly supports a reasoned argument or line of reasoning. It's important to recognize that there are multiple religious texts out there, not just the Bible. It's really important to remember that when you're writing about religion, you want to avoid preaching. So you want to consider the rhetorical situation. While I understand that people's religious beliefs are often very important to them, the purpose of the task at hand is to write a well-reasoned argument. Your job is not to pass judgment on others. It's also important to recognize that there's a difference between a religious story and a religious opinion or belief. So for example, a student might use a story from the Bible as evidence. The student could approach this the same way we've spoken about before, provide the backstory, that context, and then as they're analyzing that story, Think about the message. So what does this story demonstrate or convey? And how does that help prove your thesis? How does it connect to the prompt? It's also important to recognize that religious examples don't have to come from a religious text. For instance, you might be familiar with famous religious figures or leaders that are not in a major religious work. And then, as we've mentioned before with other topics, you might consider qualifying your statements, especially if you're worried that they might come across as preachy or inflammatory. So I've given you a couple examples of what this could look like here. Next up is, can I write about fiction? And I think the key to writing about fiction is picking strong examples. So choose a book that you are familiar with. Perhaps it's a book that you studied this year in AP Lang, or maybe it's a book that you've read on your own that you really enjoyed. You're going to need to provide a concise plot summary. Just like we've spoken about giving context with our other topics, the same applies here. So you're going to want to provide a concise plot summary, maybe 2 to 3 sentences. And as I said before, think about that punctuation. So here's an example of what this could look like. So I teach the tragedy of Julius Caesar in my sophomore English class. So I used that as an example here. If you have read fiction recently and there's a book that you think you might want to write about, you could use this as an example and practice writing a similar sentence. So really think about the deeper meaning or the message of the story. As you're writing about fiction, consider centering the conversation around the author rather than characters. So if you think about it, when you write a rhetorical analysis essay, you talk about how the speaker makes certain choices. The same thing applies here. In many cases, it's helpful to think about what the writer is doing as opposed to what the character is doing. As you're thinking about why the text itself is significant, think about the universal experience that relates to this text. That will help you convey that deeper meaning. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this video helpful, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up. Also, make sure that you are subscribed. That way you don't miss any future AP Lang content. And don't forget to check out the description box below where you will find links to helpful AP Lang content. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, happy writing!